It's time to dismantle the sexual orientation paradigm. Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to Psycho Bible, babbling about psychology and theology. And this is a very crucial subject. One of the pillars of the sexual revolution is the sexual orientation paradigm. I've mentioned this in multiple videos already, but it's time I do a more thorough teaching and explanation of what this paradigm is and what's wrong with it, so that you can better understand what I'm really talking about in my channel, especially in my coming videos and the interviews I'll be doing in the future. This is such a critical topic. To understand the different approaches that the church and society is taking to sexuality issues, we need to understand this sexual orientation paradigm. As long as we buy into this paradigm, our forms of compassion and our interventions are going to be flawed and unhelpful, and we're going to create more problems. And conservatives, sadly, have given up on this topic, capitulating to the culture. We just now assume that, yeah, people have sexual orientations that they're just simply born with, and they discover them. And so this shows how ubiquitous and forceful the paradigm is. Talking about this at all probably makes me look like a dinosaur, like I'm still holding on to something from the early 2000s at the latest. The rest of my cohorts have just moved on. We don't even know what a conservative is anymore. What are we conserving? So more and more conservative is losing its whole meaning, its own distinctives. But intellectuals as well have lost their grounding because they've mindlessly adopted this idea of people having an innate, biologically determined sexual orientation. And there's not a least bit of curiosity, even among more conservative or libertarian or more free-thinking intellectuals. We just assume that the issue's been settled, but it hasn't. And so we ought to be questioning everything that is just easily assumed by our whole culture. And the sexual orientation paradigm is right on top of the list. So what is sexual orientation? It's a social construct for categorizing people based on sexual proclivities and more. It's not just about sexual proclivities even. Now, it may have a history as a clinical term to describe people who behave homosexually versus heterosexually or bisexually. And so back when homosexuality was in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, this was a descriptor of people who functioned or behaved a certain way or even had feelings a certain way. And so then you had a way to categorize a clinical concern. But the actual term sexual orientation was developed, in truth, to be a type of identity category to justify advocating for gay rights. The rationale was that if we can convince people that people cannot help whom they're attracted to, whether to the same sex or opposite sex, doesn't matter, then we can appeal to our innate, well-nurtured empathy and embrace the agenda of the gay rights movement. This sounds noble at face value, and so it's been very effective. If you just explain that people have innate sexual orientations, hey, you never chose to be attracted to the opposite sex, so why should you assume that people chose to be attracted to the same sex? And so they're just carrying out who they are. Well, that works very well with people who are high in agreeableness and just want to be caring and compassionate. But there are several problems with the concept of a sexual orientation. I'll name them all now and then go a little bit more in depth with each of them, some more than others. Number one, it's ill-defined. What started as something that seemed simple and cut and dry has ballooned into something complex and ever-evolving. Two, it's not rooted in a stable reality, so it's vulnerable to the queer Marxist agenda of overturning all norms. Three, it encourages children and those who work with children to discuss sexual concepts before they are developmentally ready. 4, it wreaks havoc on those with mental health concerns, who are vulnerable to obsessive thinking and anxiety about which orientation category they belong to. 5. It precludes or discourages the idea of sexuality integration and maturation. And 6. It obfuscates the message that God designed our bodies to communicate. So let's talk about the definition problem. There has always been tension about how to define so-called sexual orientation. In the heyday of behaviorism in psychology, it was defined merely by how one sexually functioned. And this conceptualization fared well among religious conservatives because of the tendency to view sexuality merely in terms of morality. And so you'd hear things like, homosexuality is not something you are, it's something you do. And this actually holds true in a lot of ways. But as behaviorism fell out of favor and postmodernism came into prominence, the focus shifted to feelings and abstract self-concepts. But now sexual orientation is determined nearly entirely by self-report, not on something you can actually test and measure like behavior or even physiological markers. Sure, we have some objective markers of sexual arousal, such as brain scans and penile plethysmography, but those measurement tools are expensive and very intrusive, and most people don't want to even bother with them. So we just trust people at their word about what sexual orientation they are or have. My standard graduate level textbook from 2018 defines sexual orientation as a person's erotic and emotional orientation toward members of his or her own gender or members of the other gender. In 2008, the APA said, sexual orientation refers to an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attractions to men, women, or both sexes. Sexual orientation also refers to a person's sense of identity based on those attractions, related behaviors, and membership in a community of others who share those attractions. So we see the definition expands more to be about more than just the feelings, but also about your self-concept, about your behaviors, your relationships, about your connection to others who identify the same way. And note also the terms enduring pattern and emotional as its own justification for an orientation. It says, sexual orientation refers to an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attractions. So you could merely just have an emotional attraction, and that's sufficient to say you have a particular orientation. Also notice the assumption of the sex binary. Attractions to men, women, or both. Okay, but either way, there's affirmation that humans are bifurcated into two sexes. That's 2008. Now, the church may or may not care what the APA, either one, says about sexual orientation or sexuality, but they do care about what their own experts say, like Mark Yarhouse and Preston Sprinkle on the more moderate, semi-progressive end, or Christopher Yuan and Rosaria Butterfield on the stricter, conservative end. But for years, Mark Yarhouse would just adopt the secular psychology world's terminology and definitions. I used to read his blog, Limiting the Psyche, and check the site of the Institute for the Study of Sexual Identity, which he ran at Regent University, but now that's been shuttered since he moved to Wheaton and started the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute there. He used to have a handy page with all the terminology he uses, but now all his old articles on his blog are password protected, and I can find no such list or one similar on any of his sites or Sprinkle's Institute for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, with whom Yarhouse also works. But I distinctly recall Yarhouse justifying his use of the term sexual orientation, arguing that an orientation is simply a persistent pattern of attraction. But based on the trends we're seeing in psychology because of the influence from queer theory, Yarhouse's definitions are now outdated. Will he simply keep changing with the whims of the APA in order to stay current, i.e. relevant? If we want to be precise, even saying attractions can be too broad. To be attracted means to see someone as a good for you. And you may be drawn to someone as a friend, as a role model or a caretaker, or as someone you would like to care for or teach. And these are not sexual. So some of my colleagues prefer to say same-sex sexual attractions. Now, I still say same-sex attraction or attractions or SSA just as a short term, but I often speak of same-sex arousal or eroticization, or we could also say same-sex sexual desires. So even though I make a distinction between desire and arousal. Also, how does one determine how well you fit into a certain orientation? The old paradigm is that there are distinct categories of straight, gay, and bisexual. And this may look clean and orderly on paper, but reality is not so clear-cut. You can identify as heterosexual, but still experience a very rare occurrence of arousal in response to the same sex. Is that sufficient to make you bisexual or gay? What if it was only once in your life? What if you're attracted to what appeared to be a woman, but then you found out it was a male to female transsexual or transgender? Does that mean you're now gay because, oh, in reality, it's actually a male? So we get into these complications, especially as the world deconstructs sexuality and gender more and more. Familiar with this complication, researchers recognize that sexual orientation is not a very precise construct. It's not measurable. So in research, they measure the components of sexuality: feelings/arousal, identity, which I prefer to call as self-label, behavior, and relationships. Hence the term men who have sex with men, since not all such men may self-identify as gay or bisexual, or anything on the LGBTQ spectrum. As early as 2002, lesbian psychologist Linda Garnets proposed a paradigm shift regarding sexual orientation, to view it as a continuum and not tightly bound categories of, like I said, straight, gay, bisexual. And also she said we need to understand this whole idea of bisexual even more. And she also pointed out that there are differences between male and female sexuality. Most of the previous research had just been done on male homosexuality. And this brings us to problem number 2. Because it's rooted in a flawed anthropology, it's not grounded well at all. The old paradigm is a product of the modernist, materialist, atheistic frame, long divorced from an integrated worldview, one that saw the inherent meaning and value in the physical realm due to its innate connection to the spiritual. The modernist materialist, engulfed in the sexual revolution, sees humans as merely highly evolved animals. There's no true free will, or just will, really. Just instincts and drives. Therefore, what causes someone to be attracted to someone else of the same sex must be determined by biology. But because it's obvious that homosexuality does not serve the prime directive of any species to reproduce after its own kind, the unspoken assumption was that non-heterosexuality is an exception to the normative function of a species. And if you have liberal persuasions, these exceptions are to be tolerated or defended by seeking out some way to say that homosexuality has evolutionary advantages, such as the fraternal birth order effect theory, which posits that the mother causes the youngest in a series of sons to be homosexual as some sort of maternal immune response. It's a very convoluted theory. I don't have time to get into it. But anyway, this all stems from the atheistic, materialistic dogma that humans are accidents of blind evolutionary forces and not the product of an intelligent, personal, loving creator who endows humans with the dignity of bearing his image. Naturally, the modernist materialist should deny that our sexuality has any inherent morality, value, or purpose. Sure, it has a functional purpose, reproduction, but as masters of our own fates, if reproduction is inconvenient in any way, we can override it with technological advancements or evolution in our technology, i.e. birth control. Once sex is now separated from babies, then we can make sex about whatever we want. A form of affection between two lovers or multiple lovers, between friends with so-called benefits, mutual pleasure, solo pleasure, etc. And so then, the question of sexual orientation is not the inherent design of the body for procreation, but to members of which sex do you feel the greatest sexual pleasure, or desire, or urge? Inevitably, the postmodernists would challenge the status quo regarding sexuality, using the Marxist-derived queer theory and gender theory. If we can work around the connection to reproduction, then gender is unrelated to reproductive design and the sex drive is just about pleasure, or anything really. Hence why definitions of sexual orientation have been broadening to be about things other than sexual arousal, uh, romantic or emotional connection. Heck, why not aggression? Um, which sex do you feel most aggression toward? That could be a sexual orientation at this point. They no longer want non-heterosexuality to be tolerated as an aberration or variation. They want it celebrated as an equal and valid type of sexuality. They want the elimination of any and all norms regarding sexuality. So the unspoken modernist assumption that non-heterosexuality is a deviation from the norm that helps a species survive is now being fervently rejected by those who come from the Marxist queer theory perspective. That no, why should there be any norm? Why on earth should heterosexuality be privileged as the norm for any species, for humanity? So ultimately, their argument is that sexuality can be defined and determined without regard to the body. That leaves then the focus just on feelings or ideas. As actually, feelings itself is somewhat physical based. So we're seeing more and more a type of LGBTQ that isn't even based on actual feelings that someone experiences, but just ideas that they are entertaining and running with that may help them be part of a group that they want to belong to, that give them some sort of clout. Who knows? There could be a whole range of motivations for why someone would claim to be somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. But we're finding more and more it's independent of actually having feelings, let alone behaviors that are consistent with that particular sexual identity. I long ago predicted that gay activists and theorists would abandon the vain search for a gay gene and eventually say that sexuality is simply whatever you want it to be. And that's exactly what we're seeing now with the influence of queer theory. The queer theorists have no conviction that homosexuality is biologically determined. They use that argument only insofar as it is expedient in achieving their aims of destroying cis heteronormativity. Quote unquote, okay, in case you're just listening to this. I don't believe in cis heteronormativity as a concept. It's a term being used from those coming from a Marxist queer theory perspective. Consider the case of lesbian psychologist Lisa Diamond, famous for promoting the idea of sexual attraction fluidity. A lot of us in my field, we hear her say that, and we're like, yes, all right. Even the lesbian psychologist is saying that people can experience change in their sexual orientation or their attractions, even if they're saying it's just simply without intervention. But in her TED Talk, she says that we should abandon the born gay and cannot change mantra because it's scientifically inaccurate. But there's a key thing, she says, because we no longer need to use it to fight for gay rights.
True or false? Sexual orientation is something you're born with. Chances are that if you support LGBT rights, you said true. Surveys have found that people who view sexual orientation as an innate trait, like eye color, tend to be more supportive of LGBT rights. Now, why is that? When asked, folks typically say, well, it's just wrong to discriminate against someone for how they're born. It's like ethnic discrimination. Makes sense. So for years, the born that way argument has been used to promote LGBT equality. Lady Gaga's song, Born That Way, even became an unofficial anthem of the gay community. But there are three problems with the born that way argument. First, it's not scientifically accurate. Second, it's not legally necessary. But third, and most important, it's actually unjust. And it's time to retire that argument for LGBT equality. Now, my passion for this issue stems from my own research on sexual orientation. Over 20 years ago, I started a study tracking over time 100 women with different sexual identities. And over the years, I was frankly surprised by some of the changes that they went through. Some of the lesbians ended up involved with men. Some of the heterosexual women ended up getting involved with women. And when these sorts of things would happen, women would say to me that they thought there must be something wrong with them, since their experiences didn't fit the conventional wisdom that sexual orientation is fixed at birth. So that brings us to the first problem with the born that way argument, that it's not scientifically accurate.
And so by this, you can know that she's coming from the queer theory perspective, because she's also very quick to condemn anyone who uses her research on sexual attraction fluidity to justify therapy or efforts to facilitate change in sexual attraction away from homosexuality. So she views that as absolutely reprehensible, that we would use her own research to justify sexual orientation change efforts therapy, sociotherapy, or safety, sexual attraction fluidity exploration in therapy. Because that's going back to the privileged status. If you're going away from homosexuality back toward heterosexuality, you're going back to the hegemony that they're trying to overturn. She's fine with people being sexually fluid if they're going from heterosexuality to homosexuality, and I'm sure she would not even protest if there are therapies to encourage that sort of exploration. But what you see, and don't quote me on that, I guess, because I don't know her well enough, but I'm sure there's plenty of her ilk who would agree with that. You see that all the time, where people are telling them, oh, we're seeing a discouragement of just being heterosexual, just having attractions to the opposite sex. And so there's this cultural encouragement of the idea of freedom is in trying out all sorts of different sexualities and sexual experiences and identities and orientations. So as long as you're not fitting nicely into the historic norm, then you're trendy, you're cool, and if we're talking more to the youth, but you're more metropolitan, you're more sophisticated in your sexuality and your sexual development if you're somewhere in the LGBTQ at this point. Heck, I see frequently in the comments of my YouTube videos that there's a place for you in the LGBTQ. They keep broadening it so that it can be more and more expansive. They want it to overshadow the norms of sexuality, of male and female. And so over time, the influence of queer theory has been making adjustments to even the APA's own definition of sexual orientation. So as of July 2022, the APA Style Guide, 7th edition, says, sexual orientation is a part of individual identity that includes a person's sexual and emotional attraction to another person and the behavior and/or social affiliation that may result from this attraction. Note the removals of enduring and the sex binary. So it's not about the person being of your own sex versus of the opposite sex. In fact, it makes no mention of gender in sexual orientation. This definition now doesn't even mention gender or sex at all, but simply your attractions to a person and the behavior under social affiliation that may result from this attraction. Also note that how it's broadened to include behavior and social affiliation, not just attraction. So this is why I call to task people like Gregory Coles in his debate with James White when he says, when I call myself a gay Christian, I'm just using gay in the same way that the world uses it. They're just referring to attractions, not necessarily behavior or relationships. Well, that's clearly not in line with the sentiment among the APA and more those who are in the LGBTQ community and the queer theorists. Case in point, Wesley Hill, the big promoter of so-called spiritual friendship, which is, if you actually look into it, it's basically reinforcing emotional codependency, or it's a celibate gay partnership, even covenantal in some cases. Well, this is how he describes his sexual orientation. Being gay colors everything about me, even though I am celibate. Being gay is, for me, as much a sensibility as anything else. A heightened sensitivity to and passion for same-sex beauty that helps determine the kind of conversations I have, which people I'm drawn to spend time with, what novels and poems and films I enjoy, the particular visual art I appreciate, and also, I think, the kind of friendships I pursue and try to strengthen. I don't imagine I would have invested half as much effort in loving my male friends and making sacrifices of time, energy, and even money on their behalf if I weren't gay. My sexuality, my basic erotic orientation to the world, is inescapably intertwined with how I go about finding and keeping friends." Unquote. So clearly, at least in significant portions of the Side B gay Christian movement, or sentimentality, there's an understanding of sexual orientation about being about way more than just your persistent sexual arousal patterns. This is basically the lens through which he sees the whole world and understands his personality. And I see this as, to use a term I can't understand, majorly problematic, because it's not a given that this will be something that one appreciates. If one sees their same-sex attraction as being so connected to everything else about them, but they're ashamed of the same-sex attraction, they will then be ashamed of all these other aspects of their personality and life that they view as intertwined with their same-sex attraction. Here's where some degree of compartmentalization is actually helpful. Your sexual arousal patterns are not necessarily related to your affinity for Broadway, for enjoying show tunes, for being a bit of a tomboy if you're a girl. Okay? We need to understand that there are some sensibilities that maybe God just gave you, and they're totally unrelated to how you should function sexually, how you should be aroused sexually. When we use the sexual orientation paradigm, we assign far too much weight to what arouses us. But I can guarantee that this latest definition of sexual orientation from the APA is not the final version. There will be no final version. It's constantly evolving. Yale philosophy professor Robin Dembroff, who says she's genderqueer, argues that sexual orientation should be defined just in one direction, to whom one is attracted, and not also on the relationship to oneself. And the attractions are defined by both the person's sexed body and gender identity and expression. So to her, heterosexual men and lesbian women share the same sexual orientation. They're both attracted to women. It makes no difference to her that the attraction is to the opposite or the same sex, because once you buy into queer theory and gender theory, there is no reliable understanding of sex or even gender.
When we think about what the current taxonomy and understanding of sexual orientation is, it seems to fall into 2, maybe 3, if you're lucky, categories. There's gay and straight, and sometimes people throw bisexual in. And what it means to be gay or straight gets a variety of answers. Sometimes people say things like, well, to be gay is to be attracted to people of the same sex. Sometimes they say it's to be attracted to people of the same gender. Sometimes they move back and forth between the two. Often they'll say things like, to be straight is to be attracted to people of the opposite sex. They'll use terms like same and opposite, as well as sex and gender, and move back and forth between these. And as someone who identifies as genderqueer, it's not clear to me that there's any space for me or people like me, much less people who are intersex, in this kind of taxonomy. It's very constraining as far as what the possibilities are when describing your sexual orientation. Moreover, it seems to come out of a history of distinguishing between people who have a certain reproductive viability or status and those who do not. So when we think about these categories, it seems that there's a number of metaphysical and political problems with them. Metaphysically, it's problematic because it's really unclear exactly what these categories mean or what the extension of them are. And then politically, it's problematic because it comes out of this history of marginalizing people who were not seen as cis heteronormative, that is, both cisgender and heterosexual. So when I thought about what are we trying to get at when we have these kinds of categories? What could be a better alternative that would be more metaphysically perspicuous and less politically problematic? What I propose in that paper is that our categories should do 2 things, at least. First, it should distinguish between features of people's bodies and their gender expression and gender identity. And then also it should distinguish between who you're attracted to based on your own gender and then just who you're attracted to. So what I propose in that paper is that the way we can think of sexual orientation is as one's disposition to be sexually engaged with people of particular sexes and or genders, where we can understand that is what sort of bodies are you attracted to and what sorts of gender expressions and identities are you attracted to. And moreover, understanding one's own sexual orientation purely in terms of who one is attracted to, rather than in terms of the relationship between who one is attracted to and your own gender or sex. So what that would mean, for example, is if you have 2 people, one is, say, a cisgender man and one is a cisgender woman, and they're both attracted to men, they have the same sexual orientation on my view, rather than one of them being gay and the other one being straight.
And notice how Gnostic her approach is. To her, orientation should, 1, distinguish between features of people's bodies and their gender expression and gender identity. So your body and your identity are unrelated, ultimately. And 2, distinguish between who you're attracted to and your gender identity. So as previously stated, who you are as a gendered person is insignificant when it comes to who you're attracted to. That shouldn't be relevant when you state what your sexual orientation is. So to her, orientation is about what sort of bodies you're attracted to and what sort of gender identities and expressions you're attracted to. So you can be attracted to certain bodies and to certain types of gender identities and certain types of gender expressions. And to her, these are completely unrelated to the reality of your own sexed body. This cannot be more Gnostic. The idea of strict dualism, the idea of your identity being something more immaterial and separate from your actual body. And furthermore, it's Marxist. She claims that the old paradigm is politically problematic. Problematic, that's one of those red flag words that social justice activists use. So if the old paradigm is politically problematic, then therefore it must be overturned. When we base sexuality not on the stable reality of the body, but on subjective feelings and ideations, we have a reason to use every idiosyncrasy of one's sexual arousal patterns and one's self-ruminations as justification for a plethora of sexual orientations and identities. hence the explosion of LGBTQ+. Gay is now passé. Now it's more fashionable to be a mix of non-traditional gender identities and a more specialized sexual orientation. So now you hear people say things like, I'm a genderqueer demisexual person. That's just one example. You'll see this everywhere now. So the more we have any degree of uniqueness in how we experience sexual feelings or attractions, or whether it's an arousal pattern or just some sort of emotion. What emotion are we talking about? It could be anything based on the definition. It could be feel admiration or friendship feelings for a certain group of people, and that could be factored into your type of sexual orientation. How you feel about and think about your own identity as a sexed person or non-sex. So you get non-binary, you get asexual, you get agender. And so that becomes justification for some new sexual or gender identity. There's no limits. Based on the new definitions, it's going to be ever expansive. So we can see the problems with adhering to the sexual orientation paradigm. If you think we've reached the end of all the revisions, you're dead wrong. Right now, they're saying that attractions are independent of the relation to your own sex or gender identity. But why stop there? See where the culture is currently going. Age. If you experience any degree of attraction or feelings for people of age much lower than yours, much younger than yours, then that's sufficient to justify a particular sexual orientation. We now have MAPS, minor attracted persons. Of course, it's no accident that for decades the gay rights lobby always included in their agenda the removal or reduction of age of consent laws. And look at the Academy Award nominated movie Call Me By Your Name. It was a celebration of pederasty. Why stop at just relationships between humans? We now have interspecies sort of identities and orientations that are growing. You see it starting with the whole furry movement. You look at different romance novels or snuff novels that explore some form of bestiality or zoophilia. Some of the so-called gender identities are actually otherkin, where you identify as something other than human. Could be another animal or an alien or a fairy, some mythical creature. So what happens once people start identifying as something, and you're now attracted to one of those people who identify as another type of creature than a human? And if self-identification is sufficient to have that identity, then guess what? You now have a sexual orientation toward non-humans. It's just going to keep exploding. And it's being rewarded too. These are not just things on the fringe. Academy Award winner, The Shape of Water, was a celebration of interspecies sexuality. And then those who sort of represented the cis heteronormativity were presented as irrationally violent and bigoted. So it's showing that if you want to be more progressive, you'll embrace alternative sexualities. And the next trend on the horizon is sexual orientation can be based on more than just other species, but just entities in general, physical or virtual. Another critically acclaimed movie, Her, explored the idea of falling in love with AI, artificial intelligence. We have now the advent of AI girlfriends and AI porn. We're well on the way to the broad accessibility of and normalization of sex robots. So this doesn't even need to be attraction to another living creature. We see fetishizations of things like your car. And sure, that's something we laugh about. Oh, this lady married her car, whatever. And it starts as like a silly fetish that we just make jokes about. But we don't have anything grounded in the sexual orientation definition to prevent that from being taken more seriously. And combine all that with the transhumanist agenda of prolonging a loved one's so-called life by transferring the supposed essence of one's personality into a machine. And we have the supreme example of defining sexuality apart from the reality of the body that God gave us. We seek to be our own creators, our own gods. That's where this ever-evolving sexual orientation paradigm is leading to. This brings us to problem number 3. All this hyper-focus on the nuances of one's feelings and ideas about sexuality destroys the reality testing and sense-making of two very vulnerable populations: children and people with mental health conditions, especially OCD. First, children. When you reject the reality of sexual normativity, then you can claim there is no harm whatsoever in children being taught at the earliest ages about LGBTQ, sexual orientation, and gender identity. We saw this with a gender-bread person, where you're asking children, clearly of like a preschool or kindergarten age, to identify what their gender identity is, what their sexual orientation is, what their gender expression is. But the Marxists, the queer theorists, weren't even satisfied with that, because a gender-bread person still assumes a person, a human, even though it's still, the gender-bread is still a cookie. So now we have the gender unicorn. Talk about really driving home the interspecies sort of identification, the more and more of the Gnostic separation of the reality of your body. So we went from using a person to now an animal, a mythical animal at that. But if you're aligned with reality, you know that there is a norm to our sexuality. You know that a person who reaches sexual maturity is ready to lovingly bond with a person of the opposite sex in order to start and raise a family. In other words, heterosexuality, as much as I dislike using such a word to describe what should just be called normative sexuality, is, well, the norm. And children should be raised to know this before being introduced to any deviations from the norm. Now, how you believe children should be taught to view and treat people who differ from the norm is a separate issue. But if a culture cares about children's development into the norm that is most in keeping with their design, it would teach the norms and do its best to facilitate the development of the norm in each generation. Introducing LGBTQ concepts to children undermines this process. I go into this more in depth in my 3-part series on the gay agenda, Coming for Your Children, based on that San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus song, literally admitting they're coming for your children. And in other videos about the necessity of the gay agenda to exploit children. On to problem 4. The other population most impacted by the sexual orientation paradigm is individuals with mental health conditions, particularly OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. They are already vulnerable to intrusive thoughts and rumination and scenario building and struggling with any hint of uncertainty about things. An involuntary physiological reaction to someone of the same sex becomes the seed for obsessive worry about one's sexual orientation. I go into this more in depth in my video, Can Someone Have Same-Sex Attraction and Homosexuality or Sexual Orientation OCD? So I'll keep this part brief. But OCD isn't the only mental health concern. The sexual orientation paradigm is inadvertently used to further victimize individuals who survived sexual abuse and molestation, especially when it's by someone of the same sex. The common message, whether said outright by the abuser or simply concluded by the victim, is that you like this. This is love. You must have wanted this. You really are gay. Why else would this man select you? He must have known you better than you know yourself. He must have known that you're gay yourself. You may have even seduced him yourself without knowing it. These lies are so effective that it is common to hear gay men refer to their molestation as their initiation into homosexuality. Problem number 5. It precludes or discourages sexual maturation and integration. The mantra for decades now has been born gay and cannot change. The sexual orientation paradigm assumes people simply have an innate sexual orientation and they just discover it as they explore their sexuality. This idea has become so pervasive that Christians adhere to it to the point of discouraging transformational ministry and therapy even while being non-affirming of homosexual behavior. Hence the scoffing that we get from side B gay Christianity, and the general avoidance from Reformed conservative Christians in the mortification stream. Because, well, although they condemn homosexual behavior, they don't want us to think that we can overcome this issue well enough for using psychological interventions. We must understand it purely as a sin issue. And so you just need to continually rely on God's grace in this area. Now, I get not wanting to give people false hopes or overstating our case for the possibility of change in attractions. But when you don't understand sexual attraction in a more sophisticated way than what the sexual orientation paradigm offers, you're left with no hope at all. You're just born that way. Accept it. Embrace it, or just sublimate it by enjoying what aspects of it you can enjoy. If you can find moral loopholes like spiritual friendships and non-sexual, quasi-romantic committed partnerships. Or fight against your nature every day, viewing your pervasive attractions as just a manifestation of original sin no one could help. There's no curiosity in the sexual orientation paradigm, no scientific inquiry, no self-examination of any true value, just rumination on feelings and obsessing over figuring out which category you best fit. But no curiosity about the meaning of your arousal patterns, nor how to jumpstart your sexual development and nurture attractions in keeping with your true design and destiny. But guess what? Here's the absurdity of the sexual orientation paradigm. It's self-refuting. On one hand, they tell us therapists and transformational ministers that sexual orientation is innate and immutable, so stop trying to help people change their attractions. But then, they have in the LGBTQ+ spectrum a new sexual orientation called Abrosexual. It means Abrosexuality is having different levels of sexual or romantic attractions throughout your life. A person who is abrosexual may also have changes in their sexual orientation over time. For example, a person who is abrosexual might be sexually attracted to men at one point, then not sexually attracted to anyone weeks later. Someone who is abrosexual may have periods of different intensities of attraction." Unquote. Do they not see the irony? So people can change their so-called orientation, but that phenomenon is simply its own orientation? It's absurd. And yet you want to outlaw the work we do in actually helping people understand their attractions and perhaps alter them in some way that better aligns with their design and with their true identity, with their values. No, that's terrible. That's anathema to the dogma of this world. But you can still change your orientation. That just means that you have the orientation of abrosexual. Can't make this up. Now, a word of caution to my ex-LGBT brothers and sisters in Christ, to those who are overcomers, those who are actually also still in the process of working through their attractions. It's important that we be precise when we share about the type of change experienced, lest we reinforce the paradigm of having a particular sexual orientation, of reinforcing this very paradigm that I'm addressing in this video. See, in the early days of the ex-gay ministry movement, the ex-gay movement in general, the ex-gay label made sense because, literally, people were coming from identifying as gay, living homosexually, and then repenting and experiencing degrees of change, whether it's or in variations of change, whether it may be change in behavior, change in how they view themselves, and maybe even change in attractions and feelings. But the term, we all understand that that term is not always accurate in everyone's experiences. I have a lot of overcomers I'm friends with who never identified as gay, who never engaged in homosexual behaviors with other people. Maybe they've utilized gay porn, indulged in homosexual fantasy and masturbation, but they never identified as gay or were in any sort of sexual lifestyle that was same-sex. But they're still in the process of experiencing some type of change, or they've experienced significant change in some facet of sexuality, whether it's their view of themselves, their self-label, their behavior, or their arousal patterns. So when we use terms like ex-gay or changed or transformation, we just need to be more precise, lest we present this idea that we are affirming the sexual orientation paradigm and just saying that, no, we do believe that there are people of different sexual orientations, but we just believe that people can change their orientation, that people can go from gay to straight or bi to straight. And that is simply not accurate messaging. I don't tell people that I am changing anyone from gay to straight or engaging in sexual orientation change, because I reject the entire premise of a sexual orientation. I don't believe there are such things as sexual orientations. Rather, I'm helping people actually better understand their sexual arousal templates, their sexual arousal patterns, their sexual behaviors, their compulsions, their way of relating to their own sex, to the opposite sex, and helping facilitate the process of sexual integration and maturation. And that may mean that there are degrees to which the homosexual arousal templates may persist throughout one's life. That one may be aroused by certain stimuli. That may not necessarily go away, but that does not mean that that defines your identity or your so-called orientation. So let's just be mindful of that. Some of the messaging going forward needs to be more precise. Finally, problem number 6, and this should be the one most concerning to Christians. The sexual orientation paradigm obfuscates the inherent message God designed our bodies to communicate. The simple fact of the matter is we need to stop playing by the culture's rules. For too long, Christians and conservatives believed we needed to speak the language, or else we would lose relevance and hence an audience with the world we're trying to influence. But this has always been a misguided and short-sighted strategy. The church must offer its own vision of sexuality derived from the true, good, and beautiful. Show the world with confidence and enthusiasm, joy, what it is desperately lacking. If we have an adequate anthropology, then we would conclude that the world's current construct of a sexual orientation is inherently flawed. Why? Because it's not rooted in the reality of the body. And this is not just from the recent influence from queer theory. An integrated, reality-based approach, which is what I would say a biblical approach is, understands that there are two sexual identities, male and female, identified by the reproductive design of the body. And the male and female are called to become one flesh. That the male is made for the female and the female made for the male. It's obvious. It's apparent that this is what is necessary for the propagation of the species. When we speak about sexuality regarding other creatures, we speak about what it is that enables them to reproduce. And humans are sexual creatures. We reproduce by the species that has been sexed, that has been separated into two. It's what the root word of sex means, to be separated, to be cut. So we are cut into two sexes. So we are sexually reproducing species. We're not asexual. Okay? Asexual, before this whole focus on feelings came into prominence, simply meant that you reproduce without sex, without partnering with a member of your species that is of the opposite sex. No, humans are not asexual. We are sexual beings. Calling us heterosexual really just is redundant, as I've stated in other videos. To be sexual is to be designed for union with a member of the opposite sex in your species. So, that therefore means that your orientation is toward union with the opposite sex. Every cell of your body is designed for that. But when we deny the inherent meaning of our bodies, then sexual orientation becomes based on something other than the body. And that just leaves us with your feelings, with your ideation, with any other sort of, your behavior even. It becomes less and less rooted in a stable reality. And so the modernist approach that just based off, well, the feelings you have or the behavior that you engage in was always going to be vulnerable to the queer theorists coming in and saying it could be based off a whole range of things, not just sexual arousal patterns. And so this is why it's not enough to use just a descriptive approach that, well, when I call someone homosexual, I'm just saying that they experience same-sex attraction or that they engage in homosexual behavior. No, because the queer theorists have taken advantage of that flimsy objectivity to enact their manifesto of a world without norms. So, though I agree that we could reconceive sexual orientation as sexual arousal templates and patterns, which may go in all manner of directions, degrees, and styles, regardless of one's sexed identity, that is a phenomenon we can observe, yes. We must recognize that there is a moral design of our sexed bodies. There is a legitimate purpose for our sexual desire, and therefore a normative direction for our sexual arousal. From an integrated sexuality perspective, humans are integrations of body and spirit. That's what a person is. The body reveals the person. It is not arbitrary. You cannot separate your personhood from the reality of your body. And our bodies reveal the purpose of our sexuality, for the two sexes to unite in a free, full, and faithful gift of self that is open to life, fruitfulness. This has multiple corollaries. There must be enough similarity for a binding of two persons. This rules out interspecies sex. So a man and an animal are not similar enough. But also there must be complementarity for true unity. This rules out same-sex sexual partners, for they cannot unite as the sexual systems are designed. The sexual systems are ordered for the opposite sex and in a particular way, genital to genital. This biblical, integrated understanding of sexuality also rules out polyamory or polygamy. Our reproductive systems involve only two actors. There are no third or more partners. The bonding in the sexual union and the pleasure of the sexual act incentivizes and reinforces that the sexual union is meant to occur in a commitment. During the sexual act, men and women both release certain hormones that encourage a bonding to that which they are experiencing the sexual act with. That's also why pornography is not good, because it binds you to that instead of to your actual partner. The reproductive nature of the sexual act requires that both partners be mature in their sexual development. This rules out sexual activity between children and between adult and children. The production of children and the lifetime needs of children require that both partners be of a similar age and maturity, so they can be a unit throughout the lifespan. This discourages vast age differences between partners. And the integrated understanding of human persons as body-spirit composites leads to the personalistic norm. The understanding that sexual intimacy is to be enjoyed mutually between two persons, not merely two bodies or parts of the body. This discourages fetishizing aspects of the person rather than love for the whole person. So in the sexual act, I am uniting not just with my wife's body, I'm uniting with her as a person. I love not her body, but her body and spirit together. So that is the design, that is the purpose of our sexuality. And our sexual arousal templates may fit this design, this destiny, this purpose, or they may not. For what fits the design, there may be a wide diversity of persons of the opposite sex to whom you may be attracted. You could be attracted to women of different body types, but they still fit that norm of someone who's, one, opposite sex, of similar maturity as you, and that is perfectly fine. If your sexual attraction or sexual arousal templates fall outside of this design, we have a moral obligation to correct behavior and do work to reintegrate the attractions to fit that design, to whatever extent we can. This serves as an impetus to have a more sophisticated understanding of what causes our sexual arousal templates, a topic that's too big for this particular video. But we can at least say that born gay and cannot change is a myth. And we can also say that it's not just simply the sin nature or original sin that causes you to be attracted to whomever you're attracted to. There's more to it that we need to be addressing. Now let's be more curious about the meaning and roots of our sexual arousal patterns, rather than simply adopting them as identity markers. What does this all point us to? The divine revelation that our ultimate good is union with God through Jesus Christ. That's theology of the body, the theology of our sexual attraction. Because to be attracted is to view another as a good for you. And where we perceive our greatest deficit is where we feel the greatest desire. And just as the sexual urge directs itself to where the greatest desire is, so our hearts are restless until we rest with God in eternity. He made us for the ultimate union of life-giving love, and He made our bodies to communicate that glorious message. He created our bodies in our sexuality to be a sign of that destiny for us. But that message makes sense only in heterosexuality, in the male-female union, in the marital union of the male and female, the embodiments of God's own masculinity and femininity, His giving and receiving. I go more in depth in these videos on sexuality through a theology of the body lens, so please check them out. So, to summarize, we need to just abandon the whole concept of a sexual orientation, especially the idea that we each have a sexual orientation that's innate. You know, the only justifiable use of a sexual orientation is if it's going to be based on the reality of the body, that God made us to be united with a person of the opposite sex. But because the term has been so corrupted, there's so many misguided connotations, I say we just abandon the term in general. It's not worth using anymore. Instead, what should we do about the experience of sexual attraction and sexual arousal? Well, we ought to understand those as sexual arousal templates and patterns. Now, does that then constitute a particular identity? No, your identity is in the reality of your body as well. You're male or female. That's it. There's only two sexual identities, male or female. If we want to talk about intersex, that'll be a separate video. But the reality is, that's your identity, not the way you experience attraction. That's not an identity. That's an experience you have, no matter how pervasive it may be. And if you really want to understand it better, then engage it in that manner rather than adopting it as your orientation that you're just simply born with or developed by some accident of nature, or even your abuse. Even for us to use nurture or lack of nurture for explaining how people experience or acquired a particular sexual orientation does not serve us well long term. We need to understand it as an attraction so we can actually get to a point of dismantling what those attractions are, what they really mean, so that we can determine how well they line up with our true design. And then we can do work to cope with them effectively, and maybe even change them to be in a more alignment with our actual design. So this whole topic of this video is the launch pad to many more discussions I'll be having on this channel. So if I gave you something to think about, please hit the like button, comment, share, and subscribe. Get the word out on this. It's important that we dismantle this flawed concept. Until next time, please know that Jesus loves you freely, fully, faithfully, and fruitfully.